Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July 28th, 2022 edition of Collect Our Cousins, Engaging White People in the Struggle for Full Democracy. I'm Karen Fleshman, founder of Collect Our Cousins and of Racy Conversations. And what this series is, I created this weekly live stream series to help white people like me become more effective in our conversations with other white people in our lives. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most, like Paul Kivel. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and political violence may be necessary to restore him. And we, other white people, are frontline in the effort to work with our cousins, to talk with them and engage them in our living rooms, at PTA meetings, in our neighborhood meetings, and share how we came to have a different viewpoint and what we believe now. And when I think about that conversation, one of the people who comes to mind first is Paul. And I'm so honored and delighted that you made time to join us here today. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be in the conversation with you.
Yes. Could you share a little bit with folks who don't know your history and all you have contributed to this field, for which I am profoundly grateful? Could you share a little bit about who you are and what you've done throughout your life?
Okay, I'll try to do that briefly. So basically, I'm a social justice educator, activist, writer. Excuse me. And I grew up in white Jewish suburbs of Los Angeles in the 50s and early 60s, in a family that was in a community that was traumatized by the Holocaust and by the McCarthy era attacks on progressives and particularly on Jews. Um, I went to school at a private liberal arts college and got involved with anti-war activity and to stop the U.S. Involvement in Vietnam. And also the black students at the college realized that they were not getting an appropriate education for what they needed, and there was horrendous racism at the college. And they called on they took over the administration building with a set of demands. They called on those of us who were white to support them in two very specific ways. One was direct solidarity, bringing in groceries, taking out messages, things like that. And that was something we knew how to do. We could set that up and support them. But they also asked us to talk with the white people, with the students and faculty and administration who clearly had no idea what was going on and why and what the real issues were. And I didn't know how to do that at all. I mean, I had no idea how to talk about racism. I didn't know enough, and I didn't know how. And I realized at that point that there was one of the needs for those of us who were white to show up was to be able to talk to other white people and figure out how to do that and bring people in. 10 years later, being kind of a slow learner, it was time of the women's liberation movement. And again, women came to some of us who were men, angry and outraged at the levels of violence. And once again, I did that thing that we do. I said, I don't hit my partner. I don't do the chores, the child care. And they said, well, that's fine, but there's 3 or 4 million men a year who matter their partners. What are you doing to show up, to confront male violence? And once again, I had to step back and think and evaluate, how was I showing up? How was I addressing men? And at that point, we set up a little group called the Open Men's Project to work with men around issues of violence against women. So that led to lots of other aspects of the work around race and gender and class and Christian dominance, and a lot of the issues of understanding the intersectionality of all those oppressions and how we need to show up for each other and call in our cousins, call in our friends and family, and do this work in a daily, sustainable way.
Wow, what a beautiful trajectory. Um, and I know that you were one of the founding members of Showing Up for Racial Justice. Could
Mhm.
you talk about the origin of that group and how it's grown and transformed over time?
Sure. Um, well, again, people of color have been asking, especially Black people, have been asking white people to show up for decades, for a very long time. And after Obama elected, there was a lot of very clear, specific racial backlash. And Black people again were turning to Black and saying, you need to step in here. We can do what we can, but we're under attack, and we need white allies. And so, a couple of white Southern queer women, Pam McMichael at the Highlander Center and Carla Wallace in Louisville, Kentucky, pulled together a group of us from around the country who had been doing work around racial justice. And we tried to figure out, okay, so what, given this current time and what was going on, how could we respond? And at that point, there were a handful of groups around the country organizing white people, educating and mobilizing white people. And so the group was partly represented by many of us who were coming out of those groups or working in those groups. So we set up Surge to be locally based in chapters, and be working to educate and mobilize white people to work in multiracial alliance with people of color, grassroots led efforts for racial justice. And I think now there's about 175 chapters around the country. Anyone listening here could go on the website and find a local chapter. There's also a national membership, so if you don't have a chapter, you can get involved that way.
Yes, so much resource there for people all across the country. I love going to the Surge webinars.
Mm-hmm.
They're about to have one with her name is the woman who wrote The Sum of Us.
Oh, Heather.
Yes, yes. And they also have a lot of phone banking, all kinds of, let's say you live, in the Bay Area, they can help you to phone bank to other parts of the country or to support surge efforts in other parts of the country. Um, to organize, because really I want to hear from you, what is your assessment of what is going on in the country right now, and what can white people do to prevent a civil war or further um, divide in our society?
That's a big question. And I think we have to really look at it at the macro scale, the larger scale, to understand what's going on. You can see the everyday attacks that are happening, the insurrection, the Supreme Court decisions, things like that. But this is a long-term process that's been developing for the last 50 or 60 years, a coordinated attempt by the ruling class to consolidate power and wealth even more completely than they had in the past, to use divisive strategies to get us to attack each other, to attack recent immigrants, to attack people who are LGBTQ, to attack trans folks, reproductive rights, environmentalists. But even that is within a larger framework. We're in the middle of a declining empire. Um, and in this period where the US is losing influence and ability to direct things in other countries, that we're going to be seeing a lot of chaos, a lot of different kinds of diversionary strategies. And we're going to see a lot of backlash and violence against attempts to save the environment for human habitation, for retaining our rights that we won, in the 30s, worker rights and things like that, in the 60s, civil rights, voting rights. So we have to understand that we can't be fighting for small scale changes. We have to be working for a larger, powerful vision of the world we want to create as we fight against all these individual battles that outcomes that are coming towards us. And then we also, I think, it's really crucial that we follow the leadership of those on the front lines of those struggles, because they are taking the risk. They know what the strategies are. They know what the backlash is going to look like. And so we need to really be involved at that level of following the leadership of folks on the front lines. And that's not easy. If we're white, we've often been, I was raised to believe that white people knew everything, were superior, and should be in charge, and to downplay the intelligence and leadership of people of color and other marginalized groups. And as a man, that was amplified even more so. White men were the ones who had done everything and achieved everything that there was to achieve. So there's personal work involved in doing this, and we need to do the personal work, but we can't use the personal work as an excuse for not doing the political work as well.
We must do both simultaneously.
Right.
Yeah.
At our Surge local chapter in the Bay Area, we call that study and action.
Yes.
And
yes.
the action is just as important as the study.
Theory and praxis. And changing the way that we relate with one another, as well as we work to change the society to make it a place where we can all flourish.
Right.
Yeah. As you were talking, I keep saying, during the pandemic, the Jeff Bezos became a trillionaire. The billionaire class increased their wealth exponentially. And now more than 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. The entire middle class hollowed out. And instead of being in the streets demanding the rich pay taxes or health care or quality, affordable housing, or preserve the environment, we're in the streets demanding rights that up until a week ago we had.
That's true. And we have to think about one of the things that keeps people from being more involved, I think, is that we're not talking about these issues clearly.
Mm-hmm.
We get upset. We're worried about the environment. We're worried about the erosion of our rights, but we're not having these conversations in our families around the dinner table. We're not necessarily talking with our friends about them. We're not inviting them to join us and getting involved. We're not sharing with them our own feelings about what's going on. We're not checking in with them about what they're struggling with. People are reeling from the pandemic and from the economic collapse, but we need to break the silence around us about these issues, because without the silence is complicity. It keeps the system operating, and it makes it seem like, well, it's not so bad, or maybe I'm having a hard time now, or you're having a hard time now, but overall things will take care of themselves. And the trajectory has always been that things don't take care of themselves unless we step up and organize and get involved.
Yes. And so talk about that. Like, how can white people who are who want to engage their peers to get them involved, what tools, or not tools, but what approaches do you think work well? And I want to say hello, Sima. Thank you so much for joining us. Sima Lieberman is in the house. If you're listening to, other folks are listening, please say hi. We'd love to hear who's with us, and if you have any questions for us, please do put those in the chat, but just say hi and tell us where you're joining us from as well. So, but my question for you, Paul, is For someone who may feel overwhelmed or timid about talking with their family members about this, how do you suggest we approach it?
One way I think that works really well is to start by talking about our own feelings and experience.
Mm.
What are you upset about? What are you worried about? What are you scared of? We're all um, responding to a lot, um, but we don't actually process a lot of it with people around us. Um, and that vulnerability opens up other people, the space for other people to talk about what's upsetting them, what they're worried about, what they're struggling with. Um, and that's a very different approach than being on a high horse and feeling like we know what's going on and we can just tell people, that I think especially in a country where our culture is so dominated by Christianity and a certain approach to proselytizing, to saving people, to having the truth and passing it on, spreading the truth, that it's hard to actually engage people in respectful, peer-to-peer kind of, um, honest ways. And I think that we have to let go of some of that conditioning and just be um, not assume that we know all the answers or that we have the truth. We have our experience, and our feelings, and when we are honest about those and welcoming, asking people, well, what do you think, and what are you struggling with, and how do you feel? That opens up space for us actually to talk with each other and to think about, well, okay, so what can we do? How could we get involved? It's important in our families, with our partners and our children, if we have children. But it's also important at our workplaces and in our neighborhoods that we need to be constantly saying, I'm really upset about what's going on, and I'm really scared about the environmental destruction that's happening. Whatever the issues are, I'm worried about the pandemic and what life's going to be like in the future. There are so many things that we have to talk about, but we often just talk about them as, did you hear what the Supreme Court just did, right? And what's going on in Ukraine today. It's very abstract and distant, and it doesn't really, not from the heart and about our lives.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things capitalism tries to teach us, right? That you are this rugged individual, and if you work hard, you will succeed. And if you're struggling, that's on you. You should be ashamed of that. You should work harder. There's something wrong with you if you're struggling, not with this system. And so I think that's at the root of a lot of this shame and unwillingness to talk about our struggles.
I think that's true. It is a part of capitalism, but capitalism grew out of Protestant Christianity, and I think we have to look at part of what the message is that if you're poor or struggling, then you've been sinful, you've failed, and if you've been hardworking, you are successful and you have money, and that's a sign of your moral status.
Mm.
And so there's this moral judgment that not only do we apply to other people, but we apply to ourselves and our personal efforts. We're constantly undermining our own abilities and confidence to respect ourselves and realize that we're up against social circumstances that undermine our best efforts to get ahead and support ourselves and our families.
Yes, and while continuously enriching the wealthy and powerful,
Mhm.
and then blaming us that we're doing something wrong that's preventing us from succeeding.
Right, and it's not us, some other group, um,
Exactly.
like recent immigrants or um, other groups that are marginalized.
I want to say hi. Thank you, Lewis. We need many, many more conversations like this. Well done for lighting fires, Karen. Well, I hope I'm not lighting fires. I hope I'm like a cooling breeze into the, well, wait, not, I don't guess we don't. I'm like cooling water to the fires, right? Like I do want to raise consciousness, but I'm trying to de-escalate conflict. I'm trying to uh help people see clearly what's really going on.
Right. Well, and there is conflict,
Yes.
and it takes conflict to make change. Um,
Yes.
doesn't need to be violent necessarily, but we need to recognize that things are falling apart, and there is a conflict. There is a war between of the ruling class against the rest of us, and that it's and it's not a choice at this point. I think. I mean, the world is going down in flames, and I don't want to speak in apocalyptic language, but um, we are losing ground. We are losing our civil rights and freedoms. We are losing uh, plant species and animal species and environmental health. And we are losing a lot of people are being killed by needless pandemic and by poverty and by lack of health care, which are social issues. So it's an urgent time, and we are under attack, and we need to fight back. And I don't like the military language of that, but in fact, I don't want to soft pedal the need for resistance.
Yes, we are fighting for our right to exist freely
Mhm.
of oppression and on our own terms, and also for all the plants and animals and all the other species who don't have a voice, they're part of, we need to fight on their behalf too.
Right. So we have a lot of stake. I think
Yeah.
at Surge we talk a lot about um, being involved from a place of mutual interest. We're not doing this to save other people or future generations. We're doing this because our lives are at stake.
Yes.
And when we recognize that, that shifts the way we show up. It's not casual, it's committed, it's long term, it's relational, it's but we have to understand our state and what's happening, and it's building a world that we all want to live in.
Let's talk a little bit about that. How do we make, I saw a lot of us came out in the summer of 2020. I was so grateful and inspired to see young people all across the country, um, all 50 states, the small sundown town where I grew up, marching in the streets demanding racial justice. But how do we make that into a sustainable long-term movement?
That's an important question to be asking right now, because we do have a history of kind of periodically showing up, um, and that's not, long-term serious social justice comes from sustained efforts
Hmm.
over decades and sometimes over generations. The struggle against slavery lasted for 250 years. It took women 75 years to gain the right to vote. Um, so we need to recognize that these are long-term struggles, and we need to be able to show up in consistent and sustainable ways. Um, and it's also true that we tend to show up in visible, kind of symbolic ways. Sometimes marches and rallies are very important and very effective, but oftentimes they're more symbolic than otherwise. When the Supreme Court makes a decision and we go out and protest, we're not impacting the Supreme Court. We're not impacting the legal system. We need to be thinking about, is what we're doing actually effective in making change in the world, not just getting us all to feel good about being out there, which is important. We need to that solidarity, but we can't substitute that or pretend that that is effective social action when we show up in large numbers in a deserted downtown on a Saturday um, and then go home and feel good because we've done something, and then we don't show up for another year or two or 3 or 4.
Yeah, I think that's one of the distinctions of the folks on the other side is that they're like, okay, how can we get our people elected to local boards? How can we serve on the school board? How can we organize in our churches? So even though we make up the numerical minority of the United States, we are tightly organized, and we all come out and vote, and we all participate in elections, and that's why we have a larger influence than our numbers would suggest.
Yeah, I think that's partly what we're up against. We're also up against a lot of power, organized power, and control and money. So I don't want to put too much on the individual efforts um,
Hmm.
on either side of the equation, but it is that sense that just that we're in every day, and that's when I talk about being an ally, showing up. It's about how do we show up every day? We wake up in the morning, we have a new set of opportunities during the day to make decisions to either show up for racial justice and gender justice and economic justice, or to say, well, not today, maybe next week, or maybe if somebody else organizes a march, I'll come down for a while. Um, but it's that daily practice of being an ally that really contributes to long-term change and building a community around us who are invested in that.
And walk us through, because I think sometimes folks don't understand how their daily decisions impact. What does that look like?
Well, one way to think about it is, this is also in terms of our mutual interests, is well, who makes your clothes?
Mm,
Who are the food that you had today? Who cleaned the buildings? Who takes care of our sick and elderly? Um, every day our lives are intertwined with the unrecognized and poorly paid and often dangerous working conditions of thousands, tens of thousands of people around the country. And so we have a bunch of decisions during the day. Where do we shop? What do we buy? How do we treat people who take care of us or serve us in various ways? Um, how do we talk about these issues with our kids? If we're a teacher, how do we bring this into the classroom? At our workplace, how do we address the racism and sexism and other issues in the workplace that we're at every day, 5 days a week or whatever? That there are just so many little decisions all the time that we're making about, are we showing up on the side of justice, or are we just business as usual? I'm not going to disturb anything. I'm just going to do what I have to do and go home and, you know, have some leisure time.
yeah. And we're continuously being conditioned to do exactly what you said.
Right. And we're told that what we do doesn't make a difference, right? And it's easy to feel like, well, I'm just one person. The issues are really huge. How can I matter? But changes always come when a lot of individuals come together and have a vision of what's possible and demand change. And that means one-on-one building relationships, inviting people in, supporting them, and getting involved.
Yes. I also note that when people first start to get involved, and I was like this too, we frequently have I'm a better white ally. I'm not like those people over there. I know what I'm doing. And we're still in that individualism mode.
Right. That's deep socialization. That's part of the self work that we need to do as white people, as men, as straight or cis people. It just, we have a lot of training and feeling superior and feeling like we know what's what. Um, that we're morally superior. Again, this comes back, I think, to some of the dominant Christian values in our society. This, we have the truth and we're better people. We're God's people. Uh, um, and we really have to come at this work with a lot of humility. And we have to do it with a lot of self-reflection on, what have we learned and what do we need to let go of? And how do we get feedback? How are we accountable in doing this work to those who are on the front lines?
Yes, 100%. And how do we learn how to follow
Mhm.
and support and stand alongside and protect as opposed to center ourselves and lead?
Right. And our country, if you listen to the media, it's all about those people and judgments about those people,
Mm,
as if we who are watching are some special people who know the truth already, right?
yeah.
And so we have to pay attention too to what we listen to and what we watch, and the messages that we're getting. The messages are the children in our community.
100%. 100%. I think about the messages I grew up listening to from my parents
Mhm.
and my school, right? My parents taught me racism is terrible. Dr. Martin Luther King is wonderful. And the way to not be racist is to be colorblind and treat everybody the same. But because we lived in an almost entirely white community, I never actually saw them do that. Meanwhile, at school, they were showing us, police would come in and do assemblies where they would show us movies that largely consisted of Black people overdosing on heroin. And this was part of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. And
Mhm.
at home, I was seeing really sensationalized images of Black people on TV too. So as I grew older and started to notice, well, why is there so much racial inequality? The story I got back, both at home and at school, was we used to have terrible racial inequality. Then there was a civil rights movement. Now opportunities are distributed equally. And some families like ours choose to work really hard. And that's why we have what we have. And other families choose not to. And that's why they're in the situation that they're in. And I think that when I facilitate workshops, I always tell that story and then ask people, what is harmful, inaccurate, and racist about that story? And then how similar or dissimilar is it from what your parents taught you growing up? And about 80% of white people, either their parents taught them that story or their parents never mentioned any reason for racial inequality at all.
Mhm. Right. And often the message we get is, again, that they're to blame for the situation they're in. And we, because we're moderately more successful in some way, or that we're better people, that we're superior people.
Yes, without any recognition of all the advantages we've had. Recently, here in San Francisco, I'm actually a candidate for the Board of Education, and we had a candidate forum, and one of the other candidates in her questionnaire for the forum was asked about how can we improve performance among the most marginalized students as well as the high performing students. And she said that from her limited experience, Black and Brown families don't really love learning, and they are struggling with food insecurity, and they're not teaching their kids to love learning, and that's why their kids are so disruptive in the classroom. Whereas the high performing students, we need to have more AP classes and more opportunities for them to develop themselves into well-rounded individuals and contributors to the community. So
Mhm.
this has caused a major uproar, but a lot of people are reading that and saying, I don't understand what's racist about that.
Well, and that's where I think when we start having conversations with people around us about racism, those are the kind of things to be able to talk about. What's in the news? What is happening that people are hearing about? And often people do have questions, isn't that, I don't understand. Why is that racist? I don't understand. Why did the Supreme Court decide that? There, and that's the perfect opportunity to have these conversations.
Yes, exactly. And to really point out what not only our our lived experience has been, but also what all the research shows is the true reason for um, Black and Brown students struggling in schools is not anything to do with their families not loving learning, but with being concentrated in schools with very low resources.
Right. Well, I think that the other thing is that, especially for white people, are not listening to people of color, because people of color have been very clear for a very long time about what they're up against and how
Yes.
the system works. And every time something happens, there's commentators making it clear, exactly why this is racist and how it works, and why this is yet another example of systematic racism. Um, and so we need to actually think about where are we getting our news and information, and how do we listen to the voices of people of color and read the voices of people of color and really take in a more accurate and diverse understanding of how the world works.
Yes, yes. I want to talk a little bit about the role of intergenerational trauma in silencing us, and also how men are harmed by intergenerational trauma, white people are harmed by intergenerational trauma. We often don't think of ourselves as having been harmed by this, but what has been your experience with that?
That's a good question. We tend to think of trauma as an individual experience in this country. And that's part of the dominant individualism that we treat everything with, right? So trauma is being sexually assaulted, or being a veteran in a war, or, all kinds of very specific individual traumas. And then we talk about healing from that, or post-traumatic stress, or things like that. But what's clear is that there's also other levels of trauma that have to do with historical trauma, ancestral trauma, sometimes it's called, um, which is the way that long historical events like indigenous genocide or slavery have left permanent impacts on our psyches, as well as our material conditions. And that's partly because of the power and trauma and long-lasting nature of um, those processes. It's also because they are continuing. They didn't suddenly end. They, the oppression, the institutionalized violence is continuing. So, and and so there is a lot of evidence about how people who have been traumatized over time through systems of oppression carry that in our bodies, in our feelings, in the way we see the world and experience it, passed on generationally. And if you're a person of color, if you're an immigrant, if you are a woman, if you are queer or trans, Jewish, there's various ways that we carry the trauma of our history. And I can see, as a Jewish person, I can see that in my family, the impact of the Holocaust and the pogroms that still plays out in the way we relate to each other in various ways. But I think what's less recognized is the people who were on the winning side, or in the powerful side, people have who are white, who have a legacy of colonization of other people, of enslaving other people, of reaping the benefits of systematic racism, that we carry trauma from that too. We've been socialized to separate ourselves from people of color and to cut out parts of our compassion for other people, and to numb ourselves to the pain and suffering of those around us, and a lot of very deep and painful psychological, spiritual, and physical ways that we have been altered by this historical level legacy of white supremacy. With men, it's even more clear because male socialization is all about numbing out. It's
Mm.
all about being dissociated from our feelings, um, from being unable to care for or be compassionate with other people around us. And so that's partly that, it's partly specifically male socialization, but that socialization has developed to train us, to prepare us for the roles to be in power, to be violent against other people, and to carry that. And that's also a systematic form of trauma. So it's a different kind of trauma, and we have to kind of think about it and treat it differently. But there's no way that we can live in a society such as ours that is so deeply based on individualism and competition and violence and oppression without being traumatized, our humanity, our intrinsic humanness being impacted by that. And then on top of that is a layer of how our society has disassociated from white mainstream society anyway, disassociated from the natural world around us and the plants and animal lives around us and the land and the indigenous people whose land it is. And that has long-term, lasting, deep, traumatic impact um, that most of us are just only remotely aware of, in terms of being unrelated to the world around us in very specific and personal and crucial ways.
So what would you offer to people, to parents, to teachers who want to help our society to shift in a different direction?
I think there's two things. One is recognizing and acknowledging the different forms of trauma that we each carry. It's not all just trauma in a generic sense. There's different ways it plays out. And recognizing that, acknowledging that in ourselves and the people around us, I think automatically leads us to more compassion for ourselves and other people, more respect for the ways we're all coping with these levels of trauma. And talking about it breaks the silence, allows other people to express what they're feeling and how they're coping with it. But we also, as traumatized as so many of us are, we also have as well visions of how we want to live in the world, visions of the natural environment that we want to be within, visions of the ways we want to care for each other in terms of education and healthcare and raising our children. And so the other piece of recovery from the trauma is also recovering our visions and our sense of what the world could be like and what the world is that we want to build for ourselves and people around us.
Thank you so much, Paul. This has been so rich. As we start to wind down our conversation, Lewis says some people need fires underneath them, perhaps a fire of motivation, not a destructive fire. Yes, exactly.
Right.
And you got to feel that fire when you get out of bed in the morning, right? Because it can be so, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. And I just want to numb myself. I just want to bypass all this pain. But the uh Resma Menachem talks about dirty pain and clean pain. So dirty pain is when you're like, oh, I just want to, I feel the pain and I just want to numb myself and escape. And clean pain is when you're like, okay, I feel the pain and I am going to face it, and I'm going to metabolize it, and I'm going to understand what is at the root of it, and use that as fuel for making change.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things to that. I think it's important to recognize that there's a powerful ruling class in this country who is giving us lots of painkillers,
Yes.
and on purpose to numb us. And they look like drugs. Obviously, they look like movies and books and
Celebrity culture. Let's focus on the Kardashians instead of our own lives.
professional sports. There's just a range of actually industries to numb our pain, to help us get through the day. And they're also, as they're distracting us, they're also picking our pockets because they're taking our money, and concentrating at the top of the economic pyramid. So it's important to recognize that, not to blame ourselves for the fact that these are very enticing. They're very powerful drugs that we're being handed all the time for that pain. The other thing I think that's crucial is that it's not that we do this individually. We know that we only survive and thrive when we're in community with people supporting us and us supporting them. And part of the message is that you have to wake up each morning and make these decisions and do it yourself, and get yourself out of bed and get to that clean pain. But in fact, we need people around us who are also in the process of healing and supporting each other. And we have to constantly beware of the tendency to personalize this, to individualize it, and to throw it back on ourselves and each other as responsible and having to do it by ourselves.
I love that. I love that. Yes. When I first heard about Surge, even, I was like, why would a bunch of white people get together and talk about this? Like, I don't want to be around white people. I want to be uh, you know, uh supporting activists of color. I want to be part of their movements. And then I heard from my mentors, Karen, we do not need you hanging around with us. We need you to go get your people.
Mhm.
And it took me a while to arrive at, oh yes, there is real value in white people coming together to collectively metabolize our pain, and to work with each other and to support each other.
Yeah, that's crucial. And I think that one of the things that happens is that when we become more aware of what's going on and how things are working, we tend to look at other white people, or as a man, I tend to look at other men as, um, they look too much like us, right? So we want to make sure people know we're the good ones and they're the bad ones. So
Distance ourselves.
and we don't like what we see in other white people, for instance. Um, and you can't organize people or educate and mobilize people that you don't love.
Yes. Who said that? Someone famous said that.
So we have to be able, you have to love white people to be able to organize white people, and I have to be able to love white men to be able to effectively organize white men, because otherwise I'm going to be feeling superior. I'm going to come across as condescending. I'm going to feel separate. There's just all the ways that it's going to get in my way. And we're lovable. I mean, it's not that we're bad, or anything. It's that, our compassion has been numbed. Our ability to love people has been very curtailed. And so that's part of the healing. And we can't do that by ourselves. We do that in relationship to those around us.
So, Paul, if you were to wave a magic wand and get white people to either start doing something or stop doing something, what would it be and why?
Well, un- unfortunately, my magic wand is broken. Um, my my magic dust has long run out. My kids used it up, and it didn't work very well in the first place. So I don't have any special wisdom. I think we have to start where we are. We have to make a commitment to showing up every day as an ally. Um, we have to do the work, the self work. We have to break the silence with white people around us. We have to reclaim a vision of the world we want to live in and invite people to share that with us. And we have to get out there and really start doing things because ultimately we can understand, we can heal, we can be in a great place personally or in our small community. But if we're not showing up out there with other people, with grassroots, people of color led campaigns and movements, we're not actually shifting the power and wealth that locks it all into place. So those are some of the pieces. And that I think if more of us are doing that, there's a lot we can do.
Yes. And I loved what you said in the prior question, that first we have to see each other as lovable
Mhm.
and deserving of love and
Right,
be loving, because we cannot, when we organize from a place of fear and anger, it never works. Only organizing rooted in love
right.
works.
We
Yeah.
got to love people into the movement.
Love people into the movement. Oh my God. Paul, I am so grateful for you, Paul.
Mm.
Just so grateful for you have dedicated your life to this struggle. You are just such a powerful role model, mentor. I just have the utmost respect for you and gratitude for you. And thank you so much for coming on today.
Uh, Thank you very much. It's just great to see you and to be in conversation with you. And I'm so glad you're doing this series. So,
Thank you. How can people follow your work and keep in touch with you?
best way is my website, just www.paulkivel.com. If people want to get in touch, it's paul@paulkivel.com. And my book, Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice, the newer fourth edition, has lots and lots of resources and suggestions and ideas and everything in it that you need.
Excellent, excellent. And join us here next week on Collect Our Cousins. Our guests will be Regina Jackson and Syra Rao, co-founders of Race to Dinner. And they have a new book coming out for white women. So I cannot wait for that conversation next week. Paul, thank you again. Oh, Jill, thank you for joining us, Jill. Great to see you here, Paul. I have followed your work for a long time. Yes. So many people have learned so much from you, Paul. We're grateful to you. And yes, she's saying fourth edition. Woot! Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Until next week on Collect Our Cousins. Thank you, Paul. And
So
goodbye.